It started with a letter I never expected to receive while stationed overseas. A letter that told me the life I had worked for and the ranch I had inherited from my father had been taken from me in the most shameless way imaginable. And if you are listening to this right now, make sure you stick with me to the very end, because this is not just a story about betrayal, but about standing up, fighting back, and seeing justice in a way no HOA board could have ever imagined. So hit that subscribe button to Sham Stories and let me tell you how the Homeowners Association sold my ranch while I was serving my country and how the Army came back with me to reclaim every house they stole. My name is David. I was deployed for over a year, far away from home, in a place where the nights were filled with the sound of distant artillery and the days with blistering heat. And through all of it, the one thing that kept me grounded was the thought of my family ranch waiting for me back home in Texas. It wasn't just a piece of land. It was where generations of my family had worked the soil, raised cattle, and lived with pride. And I had left it under the care of a trusted neighbor when I shipped out, never once imagining that an HOA would slither into our quiet country neighborhood and stake a claim they had no right to. While I was gone, a group of neighbors decided to incorporate a homeowners association, calling it Oak Valley Preservation Committee, though none of us had ever signed or agreed to it. And from what I would later learn, they had schemed for months, setting rules and fines, targeting properties, and convincing a county clerk with some legal maneuvering that they had authority over lands that had never belonged to them. My ranch became their prime target. I found out only after months of mail being rerouted and hidden from me that they had begun issuing violations against my property. Things like unkept fence lines, improper livestock management, and even failure to pay HOA dues. The absurdity of it was infuriating. Because my ranch had never been part of any HOA, yet while I was away in uniform, they stacked these fines high, created a paper trail, and eventually claimed my property had been abandoned. The nerve of it was staggering. They held a so-called auction and sold my ranch right out from under me. When I came home expecting to drive down the long dirt road to the house I knew by heart, I was met with fences I didn't recognize, padlocks on gates I once swung open freely, and strangers living inside my family's home. My first reaction was disbelief. Then came the fury, and then came the resolve that I would not stand for this. The people inside my house told me they had bought the place legally through an HOA sale, that they had paperwork to prove it, and that if I didn't leave, they'd call the sheriff. Imagine standing on the land your grandfather built with his own hands, and being told by strangers that you were trespassing. I called the county office, demanded to know what had happened. It was met with a bureaucratic shrug according to our records. The property was transferred lawfully. The HOA board, led by a smug woman named Karen who had moved into the neighborhood only a few years back, was behind it all. She was the self-proclaimed president of Oak Valley, a woman who believed order and control were the same thing. And she bragged about how they had cleaned up the area by enforcing their new rules. But they hadn't expected me to come home with more than a soldier's anger. Had the backing of my brothers and sisters in uniform, people who believed in justice, loyalty, and never leaving one of our own behind. When the story spread through my unit, men and women who had fought beside me overseas were horrified at what had been done. They told me flat out, "We're going to fix this." It wasn't just about me anymore. It became a mission, and once soldiers take on a mission, there's no backing down. I started gathering evidence, pulling records of ownership, deeds, tax payments, every shred of paper that proved the ranch was mine. What I uncovered was a web of manipulation. The HOA had backdated notices, falsified signatures, and claimed that since I hadn't contested their fines, I had accepted their authority. They didn't know I had been deployed, that I hadn't even been there to receive those so-called notices. They thought they had found a loophole, an easy victim, a soldier too far away to fight back. But they miscalculated badly. When I confronted Karen at one of their HOA meetings, she sneered at me like I was nothing more than an obstacle in her little kingdom. "You abandoned your property," she said in front of everyone. "We followed the law. If you didn't like it, you should have been here." My blood boiled, but I kept my composure. "I was serving this country so people like you could have the freedom to live safely in it," I told her. "And you dare say I abandoned my land?" You're about to learn what real abandonment looks like when every house you claim to control is taken back. That was the moment the HOA realized I wasn't going to roll over. With my fellow soldiers behind me, I started organizing. We weren't violent, we weren't reckless, we were disciplined, strategic, and determined. Word spread quickly in the community, and neighbors who had also been bullied and fined by the HOA started to rally behind us. For too long, Karen and her board had intimidated people with threats of liens and foreclosure. But now, with a returning Army veteran standing up, people found courage they didn't know they had. I filed lawsuits, I brought the local news into the picture, and when reporters started asking why a combat veteran had lost his ranch to a questionable HOA auction, the public outrage exploded. The HOA board scrambled, but every time they tried to shut me down, more evidence of their corruption surfaced. It turned out they hadn't just stolen my ranch, they had been running similar schemes against others, targeting elderly homeowners, widows, and anyone they thought too weak to resist. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about exposing an entire system of abuse. Still, the board refused to back down. They doubled down, hiring lawyers, trying to smear my name, even accusing me of being unstable after deployment, saying I was a danger to the community. That was their mistake. Because the Army doesn't abandon its own, and the more they pushed, the more my brothers and sisters in arms stood taller with me. We made it clear, if they thought they could sell off homes while we were overseas defending this nation, then we would come back and reclaim every single house they touched. And that's exactly what we set out to do. The weeks that followed were some of the most exhausting and yet empowering of my life. Because while I had spent months fighting battles overseas, I now found myself fighting a different kind of war on my own soil. One that didn't involve rifles or body armor, but required every ounce of discipline, strategy, and resilience I had learned in the Army. And though the HOA board thought they had the advantage with their lawyers, their false paperwork, and their smug attitude of authority, what they didn't count on was how quickly ordinary people would rally. When they saw someone stand up against bullies who had been terrorizing them for years, I began by setting up camp, not a military camp, but a command center of sorts at the edge of my ranch, where I parked my truck, erected a large canopy, and began holding gatherings with neighbors and fellow veterans, and slowly but surely, people who had once whispered about the HOA in fear began speaking openly about what had been done to them. An elderly man named Robert told me how the HOA had threatened to foreclose on his small home after he couldn't afford to repaint his house in the exact shade of beige they demanded. A widow named Marlene explained that Karen had fined her for planting flowers along her walkway that weren't on the approved list. And when she didn't pay the outrageous fine, they filed a lien against her property. Hearing their stories filled me with the same kind of anger I had felt when I stood in the dirt outside my stolen ranch and realized strangers had been allowed to take over my family's legacy. It wasn't just about getting my land back anymore. It became about stopping this cancer from spreading any further. Karen and the board tried to paint me as a radical troublemaker, telling local newspapers that I was staging an uprising against their authority, but that backfired badly, because the media loved the image of a decorated soldier returning home, only to find his land stolen by a shady HOA. And the more Karen talked, the more ridiculous she sounded. One reporter caught her on camera, claiming that soldiers like me didn't understand community living and were too aggressive to handle neighborhood affairs. That clip went viral. And instead of isolating me, it made people furious. Veterans from all over the state started calling, offering to drive in and lend their voices to the cause. It was like assembling a unit again, men and women who understood chain of command, discipline, and the importance of having each other's backs. We weren't threatening violence, but we were making it clear that the HOA had finally met someone who wasn't afraid of their scare tactics. Behind the scenes, I gathered every legal resource I could. I worked with a veterans legal aid group who dug deep into the fraudulent filings, and what they uncovered was staggering. The HOA had not only overstepped their boundaries, but had outright falsified documents, fabricating signatures of people who supposedly voted to approve their association. The county clerk's office had been careless, rubber stamping paperwork without verifying its legitimacy, and now they were scrambling to cover their mistakes. Every shred of evidence I uncovered was another weapon in my arsenal, and I used it carefully, methodically, just as I had planned operations overseas. My unit always taught me to identify weaknesses in the enemy's defenses before striking. And in this fight, the HOA's arrogance was their greatest weakness. They thought no one could touch them, that their paper shields of bureaucracy made them untouchable, but in reality, they had left themselves wide open. As I built my case, the HOA started cracking down harder on anyone who supported me. Neighbors who attended our meetings found themselves hit with sudden violations on their property's trash cans not pulled in on time, grass an inch too high, even accusations of parking their cars in the wrong direction. Karen wielded the violation slips like weapons, convinced she could scare people back into submission, but instead, it only made more of them furious. I remember one night when Marlene, the widow they had threatened, came to me with tears in her eyes, saying she was ready to give up and move away because she couldn't take the pressure anymore. I looked her straight in the eyes and told her, "You're not moving anywhere. They want you to be scared. They want you to leave. But you've got something stronger than them now. You've got all of us standing with you." That was the turning point for many in the community, and they realized they weren't alone. The HOA board escalated their tactics by hiring private security. Men dressed in black uniforms who started patrolling the neighborhood in golf carts as if they were some kind of police force. They even parked outside my ranch, shining flashlights at my truck, trying to intimidate me into leaving. But intimidation doesn't work on someone who's been through firefights and convoy ambushes. I laughed in their faces, told them if they wanted to scare me, they'd have to try a lot harder than driving around in golf carts with clipboards. Still, their presence riled up the community, and it became clear that this was no longer just a legal battle, it was psychological warfare. Karen strutted around like a general, but I could see the cracks in her command. The way other board members began to avoid answering questions, the whispers of dissent among them. Meanwhile, the support from my Army brothers and sisters grew stronger. They started rotating in to help me some brought supplies. Others stood watch at night so that I could sleep knowing someone had my back. And a few even began documenting everything with cameras, creating a record of every harassment attempt by the HOA's so-called security. It reminded me of deployment, not because we were under fire, but because that bond of loyalty and teamwork had returned. We weren't just fighting for land, we were fighting for dignity. The legal battle finally reached the courthouse after weeks of preparation. Walking into that courtroom wearing my uniform, holding a folder thick with evidence, I felt the weight of generations on my shoulders. The HOA's lawyers tried to drown us in technical jargon, insisting everything had been done according to the bylaws, but when the judge asked to see the original signatures approving the HOA's formation, their case began to unravel. I'll never forget the moment when my lawyer placed side-by-side comparisons of my father's signature on HOA documents with his actual signature from past deeds. The forgery was obvious even to the untrained eye, and the courtroom gasped. Karen's face went pale, but she still tried to bluster her way through, claiming it was a clerical mistake. The judge was not amused. But while the courtroom battles were crucial, the fight outside mattered just as much. The community had reached a boiling point, and rallies began forming outside HOA meetings. Families held signs reading HOA out, and "This land is ours," and local media swarmed to cover the protests. Every time Karen appeared, she was met with boos and chants. She tried to call the sheriff to break up the rallies, but even the deputies seemed tired of her antics. One deputy told me quietly, "We can't do much about their paperwork. But off the record, a lot of us are rooting for you." That meant more than I could say. Through it all, I kept my eyes on the prize, reclaiming my ranch. Every morning I'd drive by, staring at the strangers living in my house, and remind myself that patience and persistence would win the day. I wasn't going to storm the gates or scare them out. I was going to win it legally and publicly. So no one could ever say I took shortcuts. The soldiers standing with me agreed. Our mission was to take back what was ours and expose the HOA for what it truly was. And then came the day that would change everything. The day when my Army brothers decided it wasn't enough to fight just for me. They wanted to take on the HOA for everyone in the neighborhood, because if they could steal one ranch, they could steal 100 more. And the message we sent next would echo louder than any lawsuit. The morning the plan began to take shape was unlike any other, because while I had been fighting for my ranch through courts and community rallies, my fellow soldiers reminded me of something I had nearly forgotten, that we weren't just a band of friends supporting a cause. We were trained strategists who knew how to dismantle oppressive systems piece by piece. And when they sat with me at the folding table under the canopy at the edge of my ranch, they laid out a strategy that looked less like a neighborhood dispute and more like a military operation, with steps, objectives, and contingencies. And I realized they were right, because the HOA had grown into a dictatorship that had bullied people into silence. And the only way to reclaim everything they stole was not only to win in court, but to take back the entire neighborhood, house by house, until Karen and her board were exposed and dismantled completely. We began gathering sworn statements from every neighbor who had suffered under their rule, collecting hundreds of pages of testimonies that told stories of harassment, forged fines, wrongful foreclosures, and even threats of eviction for things as petty as leaving a garden hose uncoiled. Each testimony was like ammunition, and soon we had an arsenal too large for the HOA to defend against. Meanwhile, the soldiers who stood with me started organizing neighborhood patrols, not in a militarized way, but in a protective presence that gave the residents courage. Because when people saw uniformed veterans walking the streets alongside families, suddenly, the HOA's hired security in golf carts didn't seem so intimidating anymore. Karen tried to retaliate by calling emergency meetings, passing new bylaws that doubled fines and gave the board power to escalate liens faster, but her control was slipping because fewer and fewer residents were willing to acknowledge her authority. Attendance at her meetings dwindled, and when she tried to enforce her new rules, most homeowners flatly ignored them. Still, Karen wasn't done, and she doubled down, filing police reports against me and accusing me of trespassing, harassment, and even domestic terrorism. But when officers showed up at my ranch to investigate, they left shaking their heads after reviewing my deployment orders, the stacks of deeds proving my ownership, and the cameras showing the HOA's security trespassing on my land. One officer even muttered, "Looks to me like she's abusing the system." Not you. Each failed attempt at intimidation made Karen look weaker, and each show of solidarity from my fellow veterans made us look stronger. The real turning point came when a group of us decided to confront the residents living in my ranch. They weren't bad people. They had been duped into buying property the HOA had no right to sell. And while I was angry at first, I realized they were victims too. We sat them down and showed them the evidence, the fraudulent filings, the forged signatures, and the growing lawsuits against the HOA. At first they resisted, claiming they had legal paperwork. But when they saw the judge's preliminary rulings questioning the HOA's legitimacy, they admitted they'd been misled. One family even apologized to me, saying they never would have moved in if they'd known the truth. Though it didn't give me my house back immediately, their support became another weapon. Because now the HOA couldn't even rely on the very people who were supposed to benefit from their schemes. Word spread beyond Oak Valley. Local news stations aired stories about veterans rallying against a corrupt HOA. And before long, state representatives began calling, saying they wanted to review laws that gave HOAs so much unchecked power. Karen and her board were suddenly not just neighborhood bullies, they were political liabilities, and that made them vulnerable. We knew we had to keep pressing, so we staged the largest rally yet right outside the HOA office building they had rented. Hundreds of people showed up, neighbors, veterans, journalists, even sympathetic law enforcement officers off duty, and we marched peacefully through the streets, carrying signs that read, "This land is ours, and HOA abuse ends now." Karen tried to hold a counter meeting inside, but the chants outside drowned her out. And for the first time, she couldn't control the narrative. Behind the scenes, the Army support kept growing. My former commanding officer called me personally and said, "You've got an entire division of veterans watching your fight. You're not alone in this." Donations poured in from veterans groups, covering legal fees, billboard space, and media campaigns that exposed the HOA's corruption in painful detail. One ad showed Karen's viral clip where she mocked soldiers, played alongside footage of me and others serving overseas, and the public outrage soared. Karen was receiving death threats by then, not from us, but from angry citizens across the state who couldn't believe what she had said. She claimed she was being persecuted, but the truth was, she had built her empire on lies. Now it was collapsing under the weight of truth. Despite the momentum, I knew this battle wouldn't end with rallies, or even with lawsuits. It had to end with action. With us reclaiming what was stolen in a way that could never be reversed, that's when my fellow soldiers proposed the boldest move yet, an organized, lawful reclamation of every property the HOA had wrongfully seized. It wasn't just about my ranch anymore. It was about every homeowner who had been pushed out under duress. Every family who had lost their house to fraudulent fines and fake auctions. We worked with attorneys to file mass actions, and with the support of the courts, we began the process of voiding each fraudulent sale one by one. It was tedious, but it was working, and each victory in court was another nail in the HOA's coffin. Still, we wanted something bigger, something that would send a message so loud it could be heard across the country. That moment came when the court finally issued a temporary injunction against the HOA, stripping them of the authority to enforce fines or foreclosures until the investigation was complete. Karen went ballistic, screaming in the courtroom that it was a violation of her rights. But the judge silenced her with a stern warning. The HOA's power had been clipped, and now it was only a matter of time before the whole structure fell apart. That night, as we gathered at my ranch's gate, looking at the padlocks that still kept me from entering, one of my brothers turned to me and said, "It's time. David, we're going to take it back. We planned the reclamation like a mission. Veterans, neighbors, families, everyone played a role. We weren't going to storm the place recklessly. We were going to do it with dignity and strength, showing that justice was finally here." The day of the action, dozens of vehicles lined the road leading to my ranch, American flags flying from their windows. We walked together, silently at first, until the chants began. Whose land? Our land. Karen and her board were there, frantically waving papers and shouting about bylaws, but no one listened. The sheriff's deputies, aware of the injunction, stood by watching, and for once, they didn't interfere. One of them even nodded at me as if to say, "Go ahead." When I cut the lock on the gate and swung it open, a cheer that erupted shook the air. We walked up that dirt road together, veterans and civilians side by side, until I stood on the porch of the house that had been stolen from me. My hands trembled as I turned the knob, and when the door creaked open, I felt a rush of emotions I can hardly describe: relief, triumph, the overwhelming sense that justice had finally begun. The family who had been misled into buying the ranch had already packed their things, and they handed me the keys with tears in their eyes, saying, "This is where you belong." I hugged them, grateful that they understood, and as I stepped into my home again, I promised myself it would never be taken from me or anyone else in this community ever again. But this was only the beginning, because while my ranch was back in my hands, Karen and her board still held the rest of the neighborhood hostage through lies and intimidation. And we weren't about to stop until every house, every family, and every inch of land they had touched was reclaimed. What started as my personal battle had become a movement. And now the Army wasn't just taking back one ranch. We were taking back an entire community. The weeks that followed were some of the most exhausting and yet empowering of my life. Because while I had spent months fighting battles overseas, I now found myself fighting a different kind of war on my own soil. One that didn't involve rifles or body armor, but required every ounce of discipline, strategy, and resilience I had learned in the Army. And though the HOA board thought they had the advantage with their lawyers, their false paperwork, and their smug attitude of authority, what they didn't count on was how quickly ordinary people would rally. When they saw someone stand up against bullies who had been terrorizing them for years, I began by setting up camp, not a military camp, but a command center of sorts at the edge of my ranch, where I parked my truck, erected a large canopy, and began holding gatherings with neighbors and fellow veterans, and slowly but surely, people who had once whispered about the HOA in fear began speaking openly about what had been done to them. An elderly man named Robert told me how the HOA had threatened to foreclose on his small home after he couldn't afford to repaint his house in the exact shade of beige they demanded. A widow named Marlene explained that Karen had fined her for planting flowers along her walkway that weren't on the approved list. And when she didn't pay the outrageous fine, they filed a lien against her property. Hearing their stories filled me with the same kind of anger I had felt when I stood in the dirt outside my stolen ranch and realized strangers had been allowed to take over my family's legacy. It wasn't just about getting my land back anymore. It became about stopping this cancer from spreading any further. Karen and the board tried to paint me as a radical troublemaker, telling local newspapers that I was staging an uprising against their authority, but that backfired badly because the media loved the image of a decorated soldier returning home, only to find his land stolen by a shady HOA. And the more Karen talked, the more ridiculous she sounded. One reporter caught her on camera, claiming that soldiers like me didn't understand community living and were too aggressive to handle neighborhood affairs. That clip went viral. And instead of isolating me, it made people furious. Veterans from all over the state started calling, offering to drive in and lend their voices to the cause. It was like assembling a unit again, men and women who understood chain of command, discipline, and the importance of having each other's backs. We weren't threatening violence, but we were making it clear that the HOA had finally met someone who wasn't afraid of their scare tactics. Behind the scenes, I gathered every legal resource I could. I worked with a veterans legal aid group who dug deep into the fraudulent filings, and what they uncovered was staggering. The HOA had not only overstepped their boundaries, but had outright falsified documents, fabricating signatures of people who supposedly voted to approve their association. The county clerk's office had been careless, rubber stamping paperwork without verifying its legitimacy, and now they were scrambling to cover their mistakes. Every shred of evidence I uncovered was another weapon in my arsenal, and I used it carefully, methodically, just as I had planned operations overseas. My unit always taught me to identify weaknesses in the enemy's defenses before striking. And in this fight, the HOA's arrogance was their greatest weakness. They thought no one could touch them, that their paper shields of bureaucracy made them untouchable, but in reality, they had left themselves wide open. As I built my case, the HOA started cracking down harder on anyone who supported me. Neighbors who attended our meetings found themselves hit with sudden violations on their property's trash cans not pulled in on time, grass an inch too high, even accusations of parking their cars in the wrong direction. Karen wielded the violation slips like weapons, convinced she could scare people back into submission, but instead, it only made more of them furious. I remember one night when Marlene, the widow they had threatened, came to me with tears in her eyes, saying she was ready to give up and move away because she couldn't take the pressure anymore. I looked her straight in the eyes and told her, "You're not moving anywhere. They want you to be scared. They want you to leave. But you've got something stronger than them now. You've got all of us standing with you." That was the turning point for many in the community, and they realized they weren't alone. The HOA board escalated their tactics by hiring private security. Men dressed in black uniforms who started patrolling the neighborhood in golf carts, as if they were some kind of police force. They even parked outside my ranch, shining flashlights at my truck, trying to intimidate me into leaving. But intimidation doesn't work on someone who's been through firefights and convoy ambushes. I laughed in their faces, told them if they wanted to scare me, they'd have to try a lot harder than driving around in golf carts with clipboards. Still, their presence riled up the community, and it became clear that this was no longer just a legal battle, it was psychological warfare. Karen strutted around like a general, but I could see the cracks in her command. The way other board members began to avoid answering questions, the whispers of dissent among them. Meanwhile, the support from my army brothers and sisters grew stronger. They started rotating in to help me some brought supplies. Others stood watch at night, so that I could sleep, knowing someone had my back. And a few even began documenting everything with cameras, creating a record of every harassment attempt by the HOA's so-called security. It reminded me of deployment, not because we were under fire, but because that bond of loyalty and teamwork had returned. We weren't just fighting for land, we were fighting for dignity. The legal battle finally reached the courthouse after weeks of preparation. Walking into that courtroom wearing my uniform, holding a folder thick with evidence, I felt the weight of generations on my shoulders. The HOA's lawyers tried to drown us in technical jargon, insisting everything had been done according to the bylaws, but when the judge asked to see the original signatures approving the HOA's formation, their case began to unravel. I'll never forget the moment when my lawyer placed side-by-side comparisons of my father's signature on HOA documents with his actual signature from past deeds. The forgery was obvious even to the untrained eye, and the courtroom gasped. Karen's face went pale, but she still tried to bluster her way through, claiming it was a clerical mistake. The judge was not amused. But while the courtroom battles were crucial, the fight outside mattered just as much. The community had reached a boiling point, and rallies began forming outside HOA meetings. Families held signs reading HOA out, and this land is ours, and local media swarmed to cover the protests. Every time Karen appeared, she was met with boos and chants. She tried to call the sheriff to break up the rallies, but even the deputies seemed tired of her antics. One deputy told me quietly, "We can't do much about their paperwork. But off the record, a lot of us are rooting for you." That meant more than I could say. Through it all, I kept my eyes on the prize, reclaiming my ranch. Every morning I'd drive by, staring at the strangers living in my house, and remind myself that patience and persistence would win the day. I wasn't going to storm the gates or scare them out. I was going to win it legally and publicly. So no one could ever say I took shortcuts. The soldiers standing with me agreed. Our mission was to take back what was ours and expose the HOA for what it truly was. And then came the day that would change everything. The day when my Army brothers decided it wasn't enough to fight just for me. They wanted to take on the HOA for everyone in the neighborhood, because if they could steal one ranch, they could steal 100 more. And the message we sent next would echo louder than any lawsuit. The night after reclaiming my ranch, we sat around a fire pit in the backyard. The same yard where my father used to grill steaks after long days of work. And though my homecoming should have felt like a final victory, the truth was we all knew the battle had only shifted to its next phase. Because while Karen and her board had been humiliated by our march and the return of my property, they still had their claws sunk deep into other families' homes. And until every one of those wrongful foreclosures was reversed, none of us could rest. So as flames licked the night sky and neighbors gathered around sharing their stories, we built our plan for the next stage of the fight. A stage that wouldn't just restore what was stolen, but would dismantle the HOA's empire once and for all. One by one, homeowners came forward and recounted their ordeals. Some with shaking voices, others with quiet fury. Robert explained how they had nearly seized his home over a fence repair he physically couldn't complete due to his age. Marlene spoke again of the lien placed against her modest house for nothing more than planting wildflowers. And another family revealed they had been fined for installing solar panels despite county law protecting their right to do so. And hearing all of it laid out together painted a picture of tyranny no court could ignore. We documented everything, cataloged each violation, recorded video statements, and began packaging it into a case so thorough that the HOA's lawyers would drown under the sheer weight of evidence. Meanwhile, Karen and her loyalists grew more erratic, doubling their efforts to paint us as radicals. Flyers began appearing in mailboxes warning residents that militant groups were taking over Oak Valley, with my name printed in bold letters and accusations that I was forming a rogue army to seize private property. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, since they were the ones who had illegally seized homes in the first place. And while some outside the community might have been swayed by their propaganda, within Oak Valley, it only made Karen look desperate. Families who had once been too scared to speak now stood taller, and when HOA security tried to harass them, they would call me or one of the veterans, knowing we would show up within minutes. It was like the tide had shifted completely, the board losing ground while our movement gained momentum with every passing day. The real pressure point came when one of Karen's own board members, a man named Thomas, broke ranks and came to see me privately. He admitted he couldn't stomach what they were doing anymore, especially after the forged signatures were exposed in court. He told me about meetings where Karen had pushed them to target specific families, especially elderly or single homeowners, because she thought they were easier to push out. Thomas provided internal emails, minutes from secret board meetings. and even recordings where Karen openly admitted to manipulating county officials. When we added his evidence to our already massive pile, it became clear we weren't just dealing with a greedy HO, we were dealing with outright criminal activity. And that realization shifted our focus again. From lawsuits and rallies to preparing criminal charges that could put Karen and her cronies behind bars, the veterans stepped up again, this time not just as protectors, but as investigators. They canvassed the neighborhood, collected testimonies, organized files, and created timelines so meticulous that even seasoned prosecutors would be impressed. We shared our findings with state investigators, and before long, whispers of a formal investigation began circulating. Karen must have felt the noose tightening, because she escalated her behavior to a dangerous level. Late one night, someone slashed the tires on my truck, and another time, gunshots rang out in the distance near my ranch. They never hit anything, but it was enough to send a clear message. My soldiers wanted to strike back, but I reminded them of our mission. We had to win this the right way, legally and visibly. Because if we stooped to Karen's level, she'd have exactly the ammunition she needed to paint us as the villains. So we tightened security, installed cameras, and kept our focus. The next big showdown came at a county hearing where the legitimacy of Oak Valley HOA itself was under review. Hundreds of us packed into the courthouse, veterans in uniform standing shoulder to shoulder with residents holding signs, while Karen strutted in with her dwindling group of supporters and a team of expensive lawyers. The hearing lasted hours, with each side presenting evidence, but when it was our turn, we unloaded everything: the forged documents, the testimonies, the recordings from Thomas, and the stories of veterans overseas losing homes they didn't even know were in jeopardy. By the time we finished, the room was dead silent, except for the furious tapping of Karen's foot. When the county commissioner finally spoke, his words were like music. It is the opinion of this body that Oak Valley HOA has grossly exceeded its authority and engaged in fraudulent activities that cannot be ignored. The cheers that erupted shook the chamber, and Karen's scream of protest was drowned out entirely. That ruling stripped the HOA of most of its power, but the board still tried to cling to control, insisting they would appeal, dragging out every possible delay. That's when my brothers and I decided it was time to go on the offensive, not violently, but publicly and relentlessly. We organized a march through every street in Oak Valley, hundreds strong, waving American flags and carrying banners that read "No More HOA Tyranny." The march was peaceful, disciplined, and powerful. And by the time we finished, nearly every homeowner in the community had joined us. Karen stood on her porch screaming threats and waving papers, but no one cared. The sheriff's deputies who followed the march didn't stop us. They walked alongside us, and one even shook my hand at the end. The message was clear. The people of Oak Valley had spoken. They weren't going back under the thumb of Karen's dictatorship. Still, dismantling the HOA would take time. And until every wrongful foreclosure was overturned, the mission wasn't complete. So we set our sights on the properties already stolen. Case by case, we fought in court, armed with our evidence and our growing political support. Each time we won, a family returned home, and each time the movement grew stronger. One by one, the houses that had been stripped from their rightful owners were reclaimed, and the sight of tearful families stepping back into their front yards made every sleepless night worth it. It was like watching a battlefield transform into a liberated town, a place where fear was replaced with hope. And as we rebuilt our community together, fixing fences, repainting homes, and restoring what the HOA had destroyed, a sense of unity grew that Karen could never touch again. But Karen wasn't done fighting. She filed federal lawsuits, accused us of conspiracy, even tried to sue me personally for defamation. None of it stuck, but each attempt showed just how desperate she had become. Her support dwindled to almost nothing, and even her closest allies began abandoning her. Rumors spread that she had mortgaged her own home to pay legal fees. And when I saw her once proud house with overgrown weeds and peeling paint, I realized she was finally tasting the same despair she had inflicted on so many others. Yet I felt no joy in her downfall, lonely determination to finish what we started. Because now, it was no longer about one ranch or one neighborhood. Our story had gone national. News outlets across the country picked it up. Veterans organizations rallied behind us, and lawmakers began drafting bills to limit HOA powers. People from other states wrote letters telling us how their own HOAs had ruined lives, and they looked to us as proof that resistance was possible. What began as a stolen ranch in Texas was turning into a nationwide movement. And Karen had unwillingly become the face of everything wrong with unchecked HOA authority. And yet, deep down, I knew the war wasn't over. Karen was wounded, the board was fractured. But until justice was served in full, till criminal charges stuck and every family was safe in their homes, we had to keep pushing. That was the soldier's code. Never leave a mission half done. Never leave anyone behind. We had reclaimed my ranch. We had reclaimed houses. And we had stripped the HOA of much of its power, but the final blow was still to come, and when it did, it would not just free Oak Valley, it would send shockwaves across every HOA in America. The weeks after the county ruling felt like standing on the edge of a storm, because while Karen's HOA had been stripped of much of its authority, and families were beginning to move back into the homes they had lost, we all knew the final battle was still ahead, the one that would determine whether Oak Valley was truly free or whether Karen would claw her way back with some technicality or appeal. And as a soldier, I had learned that the last stretch of any mission was always the hardest. The moment when your enemy, cornered and desperate, lashed out with everything they had left. And that was exactly what Karen did. She began flooding the courts with appeals, each one more frantic than the last. And when those failed, she turned to outright slander, contacting national media outlets and claiming she was the victim of a military coup in her own neighborhood, spinning stories about armed veterans patrolling the streets and intimidating residents. And while those lies might have scared outsiders who didn't know the truth, within Oak Valley no one bought it. Because they had seen the reality firsthand, our marches had been peaceful, our patrols protective, and our mission clear: justice, not domination. But Karen's lies did trigger something bigger, because her cries for help drew attention from state investigators and even federal agencies. And while at first I feared that might complicate things, it ended up being the best weapon we could have asked for. Because once those investigators stepped into Oak Valley and saw the mountain of evidence we had compiled, they realized immediately that the real criminals weren't the veterans or the residents, it was the HOA itself. The investigation snowballed quickly, fueled by the testimony of Thomas, the defected board member, and soon subpoenas were flying, demanding financial records, emails, and communications that Karen had fought to keep hidden. What came out was worse than any of us had imagined. The HOA wasn't just stealing homes. They were funneling money into personal accounts, cutting shady deals with contractors, and even bribing local officials to look the other way. Karen's empire wasn't built on rules, it was built on fraud and theft. And now it was unraveling faster than she could patch it together. When federal investigators finally raided the HOA's office, seizing boxes of documents and computers, the sight of Karen being escorted out in handcuffs sent a wave of relief and celebration through the community that no court ruling alone could match. For years she had walked around as if untouchable, but that day she was just another criminal. Her fall was as public as her arrogance had been. But the mission didn't end with Karen's arrest. There were still dozens of families who had not yet been restored to their homes, still tangled in legal red tape, and we weren't about to abandon them. So we pushed harder, using Karen's downfall as momentum to accelerate the cases. Our lawyers worked around the clock, veterans drove families to court hearings, neighbors pitched in money to help cover fees, and slowly but surely the dominoes fell. Each time a judge voided one of the HOA's fraudulent foreclosures, we marched with that family back to their home, unlocking doors, mowing lawns, fixing what had been neglected, and celebrating the return of dignity. Those moments became the heartbeat of Oak Valley, proof that we were winning not just battles, but lives back. And with each victory, our unity grew stronger. Still, there were scars. Some homes had been sold to outside investors who fought tooth and nail to keep them, claiming they had bought them fairly, and though the courts often sided with us, those cases dragged on for months, leaving families in limbo. Other residents, too weary from the fight, chose to move away entirely, unable to bear the memories of what they'd endured. I respected their choice, but it fueled my determination even more. Because their pain reminded me why we couldn't let this happen anywhere else ever again. And that's when the fight expanded beyond Oak Valley. State lawmakers, pressured by the national attention our story had drawn, invited me and several of my fellow veterans to testify before the legislature. Standing in that chamber, in front of men and women who held the power to change laws, I told them my story, the story of leaving to serve overseas, only to return and find my ranch stolen by a fraudulent HOA, and how my community had suffered under the same tyranny. I told them about Marlene's flowers, Robert's fence, and the children who cried when their parents were forced to leave homes they had lived in for decades. And I told them about the Army, about how we had fought overseas to defend freedom, only to come home and fight again for the same principle on our own soil. By the time I finished, the chamber was silent. And when they finally spoke, many admitted they had never realized how much unchecked power HOAs wielded. Within weeks, bills were drafted that would impose strict limits on HOA authority, increase oversight, and protect homeowners from fraudulent fines and foreclosures. Back in Oak Valley, the changes were even more visible. With Karen and her cronies facing trial, the HOA collapsed completely, leaving a void that might have been filled with chaos if not for the unity we had built. Instead, residents came together to form a community association, not a governing body with power to fine and foreclose, but a cooperative group dedicated to helping one another, maintaining common areas, and supporting families in need. Veterans and civilians worked side by side, repairing fences, repainting homes, and turning what had been a battlefield into a place of hope. The transformation was so dramatic that people from neighboring communities began visiting, asking how we had done it, and soon the story spread even further, inspiring others to challenge their own abusive HOAs. It was no longer just our fight had become a blueprint for resistance. For me personally, reclaiming my ranch was only part of the journey. Walking through those familiar halls, seeing my father's old tools in the barn, and feeling the earth beneath my boots gave me peace, but it also reminded me of the responsibility I carried. This ranch wasn't just mine, it was a symbol of everything we had fought for, both overseas and at home. And I vowed to protect it not just for myself but for the generations to come. Every time I drove down that dirt road and saw the American flag waving from my porch, I remembered the march, the chants of whose land? Our land. And the moment we cut the lock that had kept me from my own home, those memories fueled me to keep pushing, to ensure no one else would ever face what we had faced. Karen's trial became a spectacle, covered by media across the country. She stood in court, still trying to play the victim, insisting she had only been enforcing order, but the evidence was overwhelming. The forged signatures, the fraudulent fines, embezzled funds, it was all laid out for the jury. And within days she was found guilty on multiple counts of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. Watching her led away in shackles, her once smug face twisted in defeat, I felt no joy, only closure. Justice had been served, not just for me, but for every family she had wronged. And yet even in that moment, I knew the fight wasn't over. Because while Karen might be gone, there were hundreds of other HOAs across the country, just like hers, operating in the shadows, preying on the vulnerable. Our mission had grown beyond Oak Valley, and now it was about carrying this fight to every community that needed it. The Army had taught me that a soldier's duty doesn't end when the battle is won. It ends when the peace is secured. And as I stood on my porch that evening, watching the sun set over fields that were finally mine again, I realized we were still in the middle of securing that peace. The houses we reclaimed, the families we restored, the laws we changed, all of it was part of a larger campaign, one that was still unfolding. And I knew deep in my bones that the final chapters of this story would be bigger than any of us had imagined. Because what had started as one stolen ranch had become a movement to reclaim every house, every street, every community stolen by greed, and we weren't going to stop until the mission was complete. When the news of Karen's arrest spread through Oak Valley, it was as if the entire weight that had been pressing on our chests for years had finally lifted. But instead of sitting back and celebrating, we all knew the fight was still far from finished, because what Karen had created wasn't just an HOA. It was a machine of corruption that had infiltrated the banks, the courts, and even City Hall. And dismantling that machine would require just as much effort as reclaiming our homes had. So as veterans and residents, we dug in for the long haul, forming committees to track every open case, keeping pressure on the county to push lawsuits forward, and making sure that every displaced family was cared for until their property was restored. I remember the first community gathering after Karen's fall, held right in the middle of Oak Valley's Main Street, where neighbors who had once been afraid to even speak against the HOA now stood on tables with megaphones, shouting plans, offering resources, and promising one another that this time no one would be left behind. And as I looked around at the faces lit by the evening lanterns, faces that had once been drawn with fear but were now alive with determination, I realized this was bigger than just a local fight. This was about redefining what community meant, not under the thumb of a power-hungry HOA, but as a collective force of people who refused to be broken. Still, Karen hadn't gone quietly. Even in jail, she filed motion after motion through expensive lawyers, trying to stall proceedings and claw back some kind of leverage. And her allies, who hadn't yet been arrested, started stirring up trouble, spreading rumors that the veterans had militarized the neighborhood and scared off potential homebuyers. But this time, those lies didn't stick because the residents had proof documents, testimonies, recordings, all meticulously organized and ready to counter every claim. And with federal investigators now watching closely, Karen's tactics crumbled faster than she could invent them. Meanwhile, families were slowly moving back into their stolen houses. And those days of return were some of the most powerful moments of my life. Walking alongside parents as they opened doors that had been locked to them for years, hearing children squeal as they ran back into their old bedrooms, seeing elderly couples sit quietly on their porches with tears in their eyes, just grateful to be home, and every time we carried a box inside or fixed a broken lock, it felt like another victory over the shadow Karen had cast. But as much as we were healing, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the midpoint, that the final battle hadn't yet arrived. Because Karen wasn't the type to fade away into a cell without dragging others down with her. And sure enough, whispers began circulating that her allies were regrouping, filing counterclaims, and lobbying sympathetic officials to roll back the changes we had fought so hard for. And though many of us were exhausted, I reminded my fellow veterans that in war the most dangerous moment is not the first strike, but the enemy's last desperate push. So we couldn't afford to relax now. We doubled patrols around the neighborhood, not with weapons, but with vigilance, checking in on families, monitoring court filings, and preparing to march again if necessary. And what struck me most was how ordinary civilians who had never worn a uniform began stepping up beside us, volunteering shifts, organizing fundraisers, and writing letters to legislators until the line between veteran and resident blurred entirely, leaving only one united front of people who refused to let Oak Valley fall back into darkness. During that time, the ranch became a headquarters of sorts, not just for meetings, but for healing. Bonfires burned late into the night as neighbors shared stories. Veterans opened up about their deployments, and children laughed while running through the fields. And for the first time in years, my land felt alive again. Not as a possession, but as the heart of a movement that had grown beyond any one person's control. Reporters kept showing up, and while I hated the cameras, I told the story again and again because I knew it mattered. That somewhere another soldier overseas might hear it and realize they weren't powerless. Or another community might decide to rise up against their own corrupt HOA. And the thought that our pain could spark change elsewhere gave me the strength to keep pushing even when the nights felt endless. When Karen's trial date was finally announced, the anticipation was electric. Because this was more than just a legal proceeding, it was the symbolic climax of everything we had endured. The moment when the world would see her not as a president or a neighbor, but as the criminal she had always been. And as the weeks ticked down to that day, we prepared the same way we would for any mission, gathering evidence, coordinating testimony, and bracing ourselves for the storm that was sure to come once she was dragged back into the spotlight. The day Karen's trial concluded felt like the closing of a chapter none of us had chosen to write, but all of us had lived. Because after weeks of testimony, after hearing every lie she had spun, unraveled by hard evidence, after watching neighbors bravely take the stand and recount their stories of intimidation, fraud, and loss, the jury returned swiftly with guilty verdicts on nearly every charge: fraud, conspiracy, embezzlement, forgery, abuse of power, and the gavel came down with a finality that sent a hush through the courtroom, followed by an eruption of relief from those of us who had carried this fight on our shoulders for far too long. I watched Karen being led away in shackles, her once arrogant stride now broken. And though there was no joy in seeing a person fall so far, there was satisfaction in knowing justice had finally been done. Not just for me and my ranch, but for every family she had tried to erase from Oak Valley. Yet as much as her conviction mattered, it wasn't the real victory. The real victory was what came after. When the community, freed from her grip, rebuilt itself not as an HOA, but as a true neighborhood. One where decisions were made together and no one had to live in fear of a fine or foreclosure. I remember standing on my porch that evening, looking out at the rows of homes that had once been stripped from their owners and now glowed with porch lights and laughter again, and it struck me that the Army hadn't just reclaimed my ranch, we had reclaimed an entire way of life that Karen had tried to steal. The laws passed in the state legislature soon after ensured that what happened in Oak Valley would never happen again. At least not so easily, and hearing politicians cite our fight as the spark for reform filled me with a quiet pride. The kind of pride that came not from medals or ceremonies, but from knowing we had protected the people we loved. Still, I knew deep down this wasn't the end. Because while Karen was behind bars, there were hundreds of other Karens out there. HOA tyrants across the country who believed they could trample over homeowners unchecked, and the story of Oak Valley had already begun inspiring others to rise up, to demand accountability, to refuse to be bullied into submission. And as veterans, we promised we would stand by them. Not as soldiers under orders, but as citizens determined to defend the freedom we had fought for abroad and at home. My ranch became a symbol, people calling it the place the Army took back, and though I never asked for that spotlight, I accepted it because I understood the responsibility that came with it. Every sunrise over those fields reminded me that service doesn't end when you hang up the uniform. It carries on in the way you fight for justice, the way you protect your neighbors, and the way you leave behind something stronger than what you found. As the months turned to years, Oak Valley thrived. Families rebuilding their lives, children growing up without fear of eviction notices slipped into their parents' mailboxes, and veterans finding peace in knowing their battle had meaning beyond themselves. And every time a new neighbor moved in, someone would tell them the story about the time an HOA thought it could steal a soldier's ranch and sell off a community while he was serving overseas, and how the Army came back not with weapons, but with unity and determination, and reclaimed not just the homes, but the soul of the neighborhood. And that story will live on, not just in Oak Valley, but everywhere people are ready to stand against corruption. Because what we proved is simple: no power, no title. No crooked board can stand against the will of people bound together by justice. So if you've listened to this story and felt even a spark of outrage or inspiration, don't let it fade, carry it forward, tell others. And remember that standing up against wrong, no matter how powerful it looks, can change everything. Subscribe to the Sham Stories YouTube channel to keep this fight alive, because more stories like this need to be told, and together we can ensure that no community, no family, and no soldier ever faces what we did alone.